5 lives were extinguished in the span of 36 hours on a single face of rock and ice. Between the morning of October 3rd and the evening of October 4th, 2024, the climbing world watched in real time as a series of disconnected expeditions were unified by a single, catastrophic event. There was no slow buildup, no week-long storm, and no gradual descent into madness. There was only the sudden, violent reorganization of the mountain itself. 5 people, Antoine Girard, James Whitmore, and a Romanian team of 3, were simply erased. And while the official reports point toward an unavoidable natural disaster, the truth is far more disturbing. Every one of these deaths was preceded by a warning that was either ignored, silenced, or sold as a manageable risk. This is the definitive account of the 2024 Annapurna South Face disaster. We are going deeper than the initial news cycles and the sanitized press releases from expedition companies. We are dissecting the decisions made in the boardrooms of Kathmandu and the tents of Camp 2 that led to a body count that terrified even the most seasoned rescue teams in the Himalayas. This isn't just a story about an avalanche. It is a story about the systemic failure of risk assessment and a new era of high-altitude mountaineering. To understand the scale of this tragedy, you have to know the names of those who never came home. Antoine Girard wasn't just another climber. He was a pioneer, a man who had paraglided over the summit of Broad Peak and lived a life defined by calculated audacity. At 7,200 meters, he was moving through what he believed was a stable window. He leaves behind a legacy of exploration that few could match, but on October 3rd, all that experience counted for nothing when the slope beneath him turned into a liquid torrent of debris. Then there was James Whitmore, a 34-year-old British solo climber who prided himself on self-reliance. James wasn't part of a massive commercial team. He didn't have a string of Sherpas carrying his oxygen or fixing his lines. He was a purist, a man who believed the mountain should be met on its own terms. His last transmission at 11:47 a.m. remains one of the most haunting artifacts of the disaster, a brief, professional update that gave no hint that he was seconds away from disappearing forever. And finally, the Romanian team. 3 friends who had trained together for years, moving as a single unit. They were buried at Camp 2, a location traditionally considered a safe haven from the objective hazards of the higher face. Their deaths sent shockwaves through the European climbing community, because it challenged the very fundamental rules of where a climber is supposed to be safe. When the South Face collapsed, it didn't just kill the people on the peak. It hunted those who thought they were out of harm's way. The conventional narrative suggested that October 2024 was a standard climbing season with an unfortunate geological fluke. That is a lie. For 3 weeks leading up to the collapse, seismic sensors and local observers had noted unusual thermal activity and ice shelf destabilization. The mountain was screaming. But in a multi-million-dollar industry where summit windows are sold like commodities, a screaming mountain is often treated as a PR problem rather than a safety warning. We will uncover how the financial pressure to deliver successful expeditions overrode the physical reality of a collapsing face. We will look at the frantic, desperate hours where rescue teams realized they weren't looking for survivors, but were instead trying to figure out how to recover bodies buried under 80 feet of compacted ice. We will examine the communication breakdowns that left families waiting for news for 48 hours after the deaths had already occurred. And we will investigate why, despite the technological advancements of 2024, these 5 people were left so vulnerable to a disaster that many saw coming. How did 5 world-class climbers die when the technology to save them or warn them was better than it has ever been? Why did the South Face choose those 36 hours to shed its skin? To answer these questions, we have to look past the act of God excuses and look at the human fingerprints all over this tragedy. Before we go into next, I invite you to leave a comment sharing where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are documenting where these accounts are reaching and at what moments, day or night, they are being heard. Before we move forward, I want to ask you to subscribe and become a member of this channel. Do this so you never miss moments like this. Moments where the truth is told calmly, clearly, and without distortion. If 1,000 of you are watching right now, I hope all 1,000 choose to join us, because this community is growing, and your presence here genuinely matters. So, to understand how this tragedy unfolded, we need to go back to the months before the expeditions even arrived at base camp, to the lives of the 5 people who would soon become part of the mountain itself. Chapter 2, Antoine Girard did not come to Annapurna to die. He came to redefine what was possible. At 50 years old, the French alpinist was already a legend, though not in the traditional sense. In 2016, he had shocked the world by paragliding over the summit of Broad Peak, reaching an altitude of 8,157 meters without supplemental oxygen. He was a man who viewed the sky and the stone as a single playground. To his friends in Valence, he was a calculated risk-taker, a father, and a husband, who had spent decades mastering the art of the hike and fly. In the months leading up to October 2024, Antoine had been obsessed with the idea of a high-altitude traverse that would involve both technical climbing and flight. He wasn't a novice blinded by ambition. He was a specialist who had spent years studying the fluid dynamics of mountain air. His preparation was meticulous. He had spent months training in the Alps, focusing on rapid ascent and descent protocols. He told his wife, Natalie, that this would be his masterpiece, the culmination of 30 years of mountain experience. But there was a detail in his journals that would only be discovered later. He was worried about the unusual heat. In late September, he noted that the permafrost at 7,000 meters felt soft. Despite this, the pressure of his sponsors and his own internal clock pushed him forward. He had a flight window, and in the world of professional paragliding, missing a window is often seen as a failure of nerve. While Girard was planning his aerial traverse, James Whitmore was sitting in a small apartment in Sheffield, England, obsessing over topographical maps of the South Face. James was 34, a software engineer who had dedicated every spare pound and every hour of annual leave to solo climbing. He was the antithesis of the modern, commercialized Himalayan climber. He didn't have a social media following. He didn't have a PR team. He had a small circle of climbing partners who described him as frighteningly competent and socially ghost-like. James had climbed extensively in the Andes and the Karakoram, always alone, always without a safety net. To James, the presence of others was a distraction that introduced variables he couldn't control. On Annapurna, he was seeking the ultimate test of self-reliance. His mother, Mary, later recounted that James had left her with a detailed map of his intended route, a document that functioned as both a guide and a potential obituary. He had saved for 3 years to fund this trip, working overtime and living in a converted van. This wasn't a hobby for James. It was his identity. His decision to go solo was a deliberate choice to remove the, quote, human error factor of a team, unaware that the error would come from the mountain itself, and that his solitude would mean there was no one to witness his final moments or offer a hand when the ground gave way. Then there was the Romanian team, Radu Mate, Adrian Popescu, and Mihai Stan. In the climbing community of Bucharest, these 3 were inseparable. Radu, 42, was the veteran, a structural engineer with a dry wit and a penchant for technical ice routes. Adrian, 29, was the engine of the group, a marathon runner who had transitioned into high-altitude mountaineering with terrifying ease. Mihai, 35, was the glue, the man who managed the logistics and kept the peace. They had spent the previous winter training in the Fagaras Mountains, simulating the conditions of the South Face. They weren't looking for records. They were looking for a shared experience. They had been climbing together for a decade, a brotherhood forged in the freezing bivouacs of the Carpathians. For them, Annapurna was the great prize. They had pooled their resources, taken out personal loans, and promised their families they would stick to the safe routes. Radu's 7-year-old daughter had given him a small plastic toy, a tiger, to keep in his pocket for luck. That toy is still somewhere on the mountain, buried under millions of tons of ice. The Romanians were characterized by their caution. They were the ones who checked the ropes twice. They were the ones who insisted on extra pickets and redundant anchors. Their tragedy lies in the fact that they did everything by the book. They chose Camp 2 because it was historically shielded from the primary avalanche chutes. They followed every safety protocol taught in the modern era. Their presence on the mountain wasn't an act of bravado. It was a disciplined, professional expedition that was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The common thread among these 5 men was a profound level of experience. This wasn't a group of summit tourists who had been dragged up the mountain by Sherpas. Between them, they had over 80 years of high-altitude experience. They were the quote of the best, the demographic that is supposed to survive when things go wrong. But as they gathered at base camp in late September, a subtle tension was already building. The 2024 season was proving to be one of the warmest on record. Other teams were packing up and leaving, citing unstable features and rotten ice. A French team that had arrived 2 weeks prior to Girard had already abandoned their attempt on the south face. Their lead guide had reported hearing the sound of a freight train inside the glacier, a phenomenon known as internal calving. He had warned anyone who would listen that the face was primed for a massive release. Yet the financial stakes for Girard, Whitmore, and the Romanians were too high to simply walk away. For Whitmore, this was his life savings. For the Romanians, it was a debt-funded dream. For Girard, it was the final chapter of a career-defining project. The psychological phenomenon of sunk cost is often cited in mountain disasters. But for these men, it wasn't just about the money. It was about the identity they had built for themselves. To turn back before even reaching the high camps, based on a feeling or a general warning about warmth, felt like a betrayal of their expertise. They believed they could read the mountain. They believed their experience would allow them to navigate the instability. They looked at the same data as those who left, but they interpreted it through the lens of their own ambition. In the final photos taken at base camp, the 5 men looked focused, but tired. The heat was making sleep difficult, and the constant sound of small, localized rock falls was a reminder that the mountain was shifting. James Whitmore is seen in one photo, sitting alone by his tent, cleaning his crampons with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. The Romanians are seen laughing, sharing a meal of traditional smoked meats they had brought from home. Antoine Girard is captured looking up at the face through binoculars, his face a mask of professional calculation. None of them knew that the geological clock had already started ticking. The permafrost, the frozen glue that holds the south face together, was failing. Deep within the rock, water was lubricating the plains of schist and granite. The very foundation of their route was becoming a sliding board. They had done everything they thought was right. They had trained, they had planned, and they had respected the technical challenges of the climb. But the mountain, and the decisions they were about to make regarding their final push, had other plans. They were walking into a trap that had been set by a warming climate, and sprung by their own refusal to hear what the mountain was telling them. As October 1st arrived, the wind died down, and the sky turned a brilliant, deceptive blue. It was the perfect summit window, the kind of weather that makes climbers forget everything but the peak. James Whitmore was the first to move. He packed his light solo kit, took a final sip of tea, and began his ascent. He didn't say goodbye to the others. He simply stepped onto the ice and began to climb. The Romanians and Girard would follow within 24 hours. They were moving into a vertical world that was about to disappear. But before the ice gave way, there was a single moment of decision, a moment where the path to survival and the path to death diverged. Chapter 3. The line between a heroic ascent and a fatal mistake is often invisible until the moment of impact. For the 5 men on Annapurna's south face, that line was crossed on the morning of October 2nd, 2024. The decision that sealed their fate wasn't a single dramatic moment of bravado. It was a series of incremental compromises, each one justified by their immense experience and the immense cost of their expeditions. In the high-stakes environment of 8,000-meter peaks, the most dangerous thing a climber can possess isn't a lack of skill. It is a surplus of confidence. James Whitmore made his fatal decision at 4:30 a.m. Standing at the base of the central pillar, he looked up at the Serek Bulge, a massive, overhanging architectural nightmare of blue ice that loomed over the direct route. To any standard expedition, this feature was a no-go zone, a literal game of Russian roulette. But James was solo. He believed that his primary defense was speed. He calculated that if he could move through the kill zone in under 2 hours, the statistical probability of a collapse occurring in that exact window was negligible. He chose to bypass the safer, more circuitous eastern ridge, which would have added 2 days to his climb, in favor of the direct line. He reasoned that staying on the mountain longer was a greater risk than a brief exposure to the Serek. This was the speed fallacy. It's a logic used by soloists to justify extreme objective hazards, but it ignores a fundamental truth. The mountain doesn't care how fast you are moving if the entire slope decides to let go. James committed to the direct line, unroped, with no way to anchor himself if the ice shifted. He was betting his life on a 2-hour window of stability. At the same time, Antoine Girard was making a different, but equally lethal calculation. His hike-and-fly mission required very specific atmospheric conditions: low wind at the summit and high thermal lift in the valleys. His weather window was closing. A massive high-pressure system was moving in, which would bring stable skies but also a significant spike in wind speeds by October 5th. If he didn't reach his launch point at 200 meters by the 3rd, his entire project would be grounded. To hit this target, Girard decided to skip his final acclimatization rotation. Usually, a climber would spend a night at 500 meters before attempting a push to 7,000 plus. Girard, feeling strong and fueled by the pressure of his sponsors who were waiting for the summit flight footage, decided to push straight from Camp 1 to his launch zone. He was trading his physical reserve for time. He knew he would be more exhausted, and his reaction times would be slower, but he believed his 30 years of experience would compensate for the physiological strain. He was wrong. Altitude doesn't respect experience. It only respects biology. By skipping his rotation, Girard was entering the most dangerous part of the mountain, with a brain and body that were already beginning to suffer from the subtle, cognitive dulling effects of rapid ascent. While Whitmore and Girard were pushing upward, the Romanian team of Radu, Adrian, and Mihai were at Camp 2, engaged in a heated debate. They had seen the slush on the lower slopes. They had watched small wet slab avalanches peeling off the face throughout the afternoon of October 1st. They knew the temperatures were dangerously high. Radu, the veteran, had suggested a retreat to base camp to wait for a freeze. However, the team had purchased a premium weather forecasting service, a high-tech subscription that utilized AI-driven models to predict local microclimates. The report they received at 6 p.m. stated that a cooling trend would hit the south face by midnight, stabilizing the snowpack. They chose to trust the digital data over their own eyes. They decided to stay at Camp 2, situated on a prominent shelf they believed was safe. The fatal decision here was the technological trap, the belief that a sensor or an algorithm knows more about the mountain than the person standing on it. They stayed in their tents, confident that the cooling trend would arrive. It never did. The premium forecast had failed to account for a localized thermal inversion that was actually trapping heat against the south face, turning the ice into the consistency of rotting granulated sugar. These decisions didn't happen in a vacuum. There were voices of reason that were dismissed. Lakpa Sherpa, a veteran of 15 Annapurna seasons who was working for a separate commercial team, had spoken to the Romanians via radio. He told them bluntly, "The face is moving. Come down." He was ignored. Lakpa later testified that there was an atmosphere of summit fever at base camp that had infected even the independent climbers. The 2024 season had been plagued by delays, and there was a desperate, almost manic energy to make something happen before the winter winds arrived. The Swiss team, situated just a few hundred meters from the Romanians, made the opposite choice. Their lead climber, Marc-André Vogel, noticed that the picket tension, the force required to drive a safety stake into the snow, was dropping. The snow was losing its structural integrity. He ordered his team to descend immediately, even as they watched Whitmore and Girard continue upward. Vogel later described the feeling of, quote, watching men walk into a burning building while they thought they were entering a palace. The Swiss team began their descent at 10 p.m. on October 2nd. They are the only reason we have a detailed eyewitness account of the conditions that night. By 2 a.m. on October 3rd, the moment of no return had passed. James Whitmore had cleared the Bergschrund and was deep into the central pillar. Antoine Girard was approaching 7,000 meters. His breathing labored, his movements becoming heavy and rhythmic. The Romanians were asleep in their tents at Camp 2, believing they were through the worst of the heat. What none of these men realized was that the mountain was no longer a static object. The internal temperature of the glacier had reached a critical tipping point. Underneath the surface, billions of gallons of meltwater were acting as a lubricant between the bedrock and the ice sheet. The entire south face was now floating on a thin film of water. In the world of geology, this is known as a, quote, catastrophic failure event. It doesn't happen slowly. It happens at the speed of sound. A single crack, often invisible to the eye, begins to propagate across the face. For the climbers, there would be no warning. No long, rumbling sound of a distant slide. Just a sudden, violent shift in the world. James Whitmore was the highest. He was moving toward the final headwall, his headlamp, a tiny, flickering spark against the massive dark wall of the mountain. He was exhausted, but he was winning. He had beaten the Sirac Bulge. He had proven his speed theory. He reached for his radio to make his scheduled 11:47 a.m. check-in, a routine call to let base camp know he was still alive and moving. But James didn't know what was already happening higher on the mountain, far above his head, where the very summit ridge was beginning to delaminate from the rock. Chapter 4. The first sign that the mountain was failing wasn't a sound, it was a smell. At 7 a.m. on October 3rd, Radu Mate stepped out of his tent at Camp 2 and was hit by the scent of wet, raw earth. At 500 meters, the air should smell of nothing but sterile cold and ozone. The smell of soil meant that the permafrost, the ancient ice that acts as the rebar of the mountain, was melting deep within the rock. Radu looked at his thermometer. It was 4 degrees Celsius. At this altitude, in the shade of the early morning, it should have been -15. This was the thermal inversion that the Romanian team's premium forecast had failed to predict. Instead of cooling, the south face had spent the night acting like a massive radiator, trapping the previous day's solar energy. The Romanians had a 3-hour window to descend. If they had started moving the moment Radu smelled the earth, they would have been below the primary fracture line by noon. But they didn't. They sat in their tent, drinking tea and rationalizing the danger. They convinced themselves that the warmth was a freak spike, and that the cooling trend promised by their satellite data was just delayed. This is the normalization of deviance, a psychological trap where climbers witness a dangerous anomaly, but because it hasn't killed them yet, they incorporate it into their new definition of normal. They decided to wait until the 10 a.m. weather update before making a move. That decision cost them their lives. Higher up, at 200 meters, Antoine Girard was beginning to realize he had made a grave mistake by skipping his final acclimatization rotation. His movements were no longer the fluid, rhythmic motions of a master alpinist. They were the jerky, desperate lunges of a man fighting for air. His pulse oximeter, a device used to measure blood oxygen levels, showed 64%. Anything below 70% at that altitude is a medical emergency. Girard was suffering from early-stage HACE, high-altitude cerebral edema. His brain was swelling, pushing against the walls of his skull. In his later recovered GoPro footage, Girard can be heard gasping, talking to himself in a slurred, rhythmic French. He was struggling with his paragliding wing, which felt like a lead weight on his back. A sane man would have dropped the gear and descended. But Girard's identity was tied to the flight. To descend without flying was, in his oxygen-starved mind, a total failure. He continued to crawl toward his launch point, unaware that his cognitive functions were so impaired that he was no longer capable of reading the snow. He was moving across a loaded slope, a convex roll of snow that was holding onto the mountain by a thread. He was essentially walking across a landmine. At 11:47 a.m., James Whitmore made his final radio transmission. He was at 800 meters, just below the summit ridge. His voice was calm, but there was an underlying tension that the base camp operator, Tashi, would later describe as, quote, unsettling. James said, Tashi, the snow here is like mashed potatoes. I'm up to my waist in some spots. I'm going to try to traverse to the rock rib to get some solid footing. The whole face feels hollow. Do you copy? Tashi urged him to stop and find a place to bivouac. But James was a soloist. He knew that stopping on a hollow face was a death sentence. He had to reach the rock. He told Tashi he would check in again at 2 p.m. He never did. That 11:47 a.m. call was the last time anyone heard James Whitmore's voice. In that moment, he was the highest person on the mountain, completely alone, standing on a surface that he himself had described as, quote, hollow. He was 200 meters from the summit, but he might as well have been on another planet. The clock was now ticking toward the solar peak, the time of day when solar radiation is at its strongest. Between 12 p.m. and 1 p.m., the temperature on the south face hit its maximum. At base camp, Observers watched through high-powered spotting scopes as weeping began to occur. Small streams of water were actually visible, trickling down the granite faces. This is unheard of at these altitudes. It was the physical manifestation of the mountain's structural failure. A group of Sherpas at base camp began to pray. They knew what the mashed potato snow and the weeping rock meant. They tried to radio the Romanians at Camp 2, but the team had switched off their radio to save battery for their evening summit push. This is a common and often fatal mistake. In an effort to save their gear for the future, they cut their only lifeline to the present. They were sitting in their tents, less than 500 meters from a massive ice cliff that was now vibrating with the stress of its own weight. At 12:14 p.m., the first shot was fired. It wasn't an avalanche, but a tension crack, a horizontal fracture that ripped across the face at 7,400 meters. The sound was heard at base camp, 6 kilometers away. It sounded like a naval gun firing. Antoine Girard was only 200 meters away from this fracture. In his delirium, he likely didn't understand what the sound meant. He was focused on his paragliding harness, trying to untangle the lines in the thinning air. He was at his launch point, but the wind was wrong. It was swirling, a sign of the massive air displacement occurring as the face began to shift. The Romanians at Camp 2 finally heard the sound and scrambled out of their tents. For the first time, the reality of their situation broke through the technological trap. They saw the fracture line. It was a jagged, black scar across the white face of the mountain, nearly a mile long. They realized that they were directly in the path of whatever was about to happen. They began a frantic attempt to pack their gear, but at 500 meters, you cannot move quickly. The simple act of putting on boots and crampons takes 20 minutes. They didn't have 20 minutes. At 12:30 p.m., the catastrophic failure began. It didn't start at the top. It started in the middle. The Serac bulge, the feature James Whitmore had sped under hours earlier, simply let go. 10,000 tons of ice, the size of 4 city blocks, detached from the mountain. As it fell, it acted as a trigger. The vibration from the Serac's impact hit the hollow snow that James Whitmore was standing on. It hit the mashed potato slope where Antoine Girard was prepping his wing. And it moved toward the safe shelf where the Romanians were still struggling with their boots. The escalation was over. The mountain was no longer in a state of unstable equilibrium. It was now in a state of kinetic collapse. In the next 90 seconds, 5 lives would be reduced to statistics. And then, at 12:31 p.m., everything fell apart. Chapter 5, 12 hours, 31 minutes, and 5 seconds p.m. The physics of a mountain collapse are as simple as they are terrifying. When the Serac bulge detached, it wasn't a slow slide. It was a free fall of 10,000 tons of prehistoric ice. As this mass struck the mid-mountain slopes at nearly 100 miles per hour, it converted its potential energy into a shock wave, a literal wall of compressed air that traveled ahead of the debris. For the climbers on the south face, this air blast arrived seconds before the ice did. It was a force powerful enough to strip the clothes from a human body and flatten a high-altitude tent as if it were made of paper. James Whitmore was the first to be taken. At 800 meters, he was standing on the very edge of the primary fracture line. In his final radio call, he had described the snow as hollow. He was right. When the vibration from the lower Serac collapse hit his position, the entire slope, a slab of snow 300 meters wide and 10 meters deep, simply delaminated from the bedrock. Because James was solo and unroped, he had no anchor to the world. He didn't fall into the dawn and avalanche. He became part of the mountain's shifting skin. One moment he was looking toward the summit ridge, 3 minutes from the highest point of his life. The next, the ground beneath his boots ceased to exist. James Whitmore was carried 3,000 feet down the face in a matter of seconds. At those speeds, the human body is no longer a solid object. It is a projectile. He was likely unconscious within the first 5 seconds as the turbulent flow of ice blocks, some the size of cars, battered him into the abyss. There was no time for a final radio call. There was only a sudden, violent silence where a man had been standing heartbeats before. At 7,200 meters, Antoine Girard was caught in a different kind of horror. He had been preparing his paragliding wing, a massive sail of ultralight nylon designed to catch the wind. When the air blast from the collapse hit his position, the wing didn't just inflate, it became a lethal tether. The 200-mile-per-hour gust caught the fabric, and Antoine was jerked from his stance with such force that his safety anchors were ripped clean out of the rotten ice. His GoPro, which remained running for another 12 seconds, captured the terrifying reality of his final moments. The footage shows the horizon spinning violently as Antoine is tossed into the air, tethered to a wing that is now being shredded by the very debris it was meant to fly over. He wasn't buried immediately. He was flown into the path of the falling Serac. The wing, meant to be his salvation and his masterpiece, had become his executioner. He was dragged into the primary chute of the avalanche, disappearing into the white death at 12 hours 31 minutes and 45 seconds p.m. Basecamp watched the entire event through spotting scopes. The operator, Tashi, described the site of the south face simply vanishing behind a cloud of white powder that rose 2 kilometers into the air. "The mountain was there," Tashi later said, "and then the mountain was a cloud. We started screaming into the radios, but we knew. You don't survive a collapse of that scale. We called James. We called Antoine. We called the Romanians. Nothing but static." The Romanians, Radu, Adrian, and Mihai, were at 500 meters, sitting at Camp 2. They had heard the shot of the fracture, and as we know, they were struggling to get their boots on. They had roughly 40 seconds from the moment the Serac hit to the moment the debris reached their shelf. 40 seconds is enough time to realize you are going to die, but not enough time to do anything about it. Radu, the veteran, was seen by a climber on a neighboring ridge attempting to dive behind a prominent rock rib just above the tents. Adrian and Mihai were still inside the tent fabric, likely blinded by the spindrift that preceded the main impact. When the debris hit Camp 2, it wasn't a soft blanket of snow. It was a slurry of ice, rock, and freezing water. The safe shelf they had chosen acted like a catchment basin. The avalanche didn't just pass over them. It filled the shelf, burying the entire camp under 60 feet of compacted debris in less than 10 seconds. The force was so great that it didn't just bury the tents. It pulverized them. Fragments of yellow nylon and pieces of sleeping bags would later be found 3 kilometers away, blown there by the air blast. The Romanian team, 3 friends who had promised to stick together, were unified one last time under millions of tons of ice. They had trusted the technology, they had trusted their safe camp, and they had trusted that the mountain would play by the rules of the past. But the rules had changed. At 12:33 p.m., the south face was silent. The cloud of powder began to settle, revealing a landscape that had been completely rewritten. The central pillar was gone. The Serac bulge was a jagged scar, and the 3 camps that had dotted the face were erased. But the tragedy wasn't over. While 5 men were now missing and presumed dead, the 36-hour window of death was only half finished. At base camp, the horror was transitioning into a frantic, chaotic attempt at organization. There were other climbers on the lower slopes, Sherpas and support staff, who were now caught in the aftermath. The air blast had triggered secondary slides on the surrounding peaks, and the safe routes back to base camp were now severed. By 2 p.m., the first rescue helicopter was in the air, but the pilots were forced to turn back. The heat that had caused the collapse was now creating massive thermal turbulence, making flight at 6,000 meters a suicide mission. The mountain was still, quote, settling. Every few minutes, another secondary slide would roar down the face, scouring the search area and burying any potential survivors even deeper. The survivors at base camp faced an impossible dilemma. Every instinct told them to move up, to search the debris, to find their friends. But the mountain was still screaming. The thermal inversion hadn't broken. The ice was still melting. To send a search party onto the south face was to send more people to their deaths. They had to sit and watch through binoculars as the sun began to set on the first day of the disaster, knowing that if anyone was still alive, trapped in an air pocket, or clinging to a rock rib, they would have to survive a night in the death zone, with no gear, no oxygen, and no hope of help. At 6 p.m., a faint signal was detected on the radio frequency assigned to the Romanian team. It wasn't a voice. It was a rhythmic clicking, the sound of someone keyed the mic but unable to speak. Base camp erupted in a frenzy. "Radu? Adrian? Is that you?" There was no response, just the clicking. For 3 hours, the base camp team stayed on the radio, begging for a word, a sign, anything. The clicking continued, until 9:14 p.m. And then, it stopped forever. Who was clicking that radio? Was it one of the Romanians, trapped in a crushed tent, slowly suffocating? Or was it a ghost in the machine, a short circuit caused by the freezing water and the pressure of the ice? That sound would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The possibility that someone had survived the initial impact, only to be left alone in the dark, watching the lights of base camp from beneath the snow, waiting for a rescue that couldn't come. As the first night of the disaster took hold, the death toll stood at 5. But as the sun rose on October 4th, the rescue teams would realize that the mountain wasn't finished. The collapse had triggered a series of events that would now put the rescuers themselves in the crosshairs. But the dying was just beginning. Chapter 6. By 5 a.m. on October 4th, the clicking from the Romanian radio frequency had been silent for nearly 8 hours. The temperature had finally dropped to -20 degrees Celsius, but the damage was already done. The south face was now a graveyard of jagged, refrozen ice blocks. At first light, a B-3 Squirrel helicopter, piloted by Captain Ananda Simkata, one of the most experienced high-altitude pilots in Nepal, lifted off from Pokhara. His mission was a reconnaissance flight to look for surface anomalies, anything that didn't look like snow. At 6:15 a.m., Simkata reached the debris field above Camp 2. He spotted something neon green. It was a fragment of Antoine Girard's paragliding wing, snagged on a rock rib at 800 meters. The rest of the wing trailed down into a massive bergschrund. Simkata lowered the helicopter as much as the thin air would allow. He didn't see a man. He saw a shape. Antoine Girard had been carried nearly 400 vertical meters from his launch point. He was partially visible, his body entangled in the high-tensile Kevlar lines of his wing. The very thing that was supposed to make him fly had anchored him to the path of the avalanche. Simkata reported the sighting to base camp. "I see Girard. Position 6, 800. He is not moving. There is no heat signature." In the high-altitude world, no heat signature is the polite way of saying someone is a corpse. The rescue mission for Antoine Girard officially transitioned into a recovery mission at 6:42 a.m. But the Romanians and James Whitmore were still unaccounted for. A ground rescue team, led by Lakwa Sherpa and 3 other veterans, began a desperate push toward Camp 2. They were moving through a landscape that defied logic. Routes that had existed for 40 years were gone. They were climbing over fresh debris, unstable blocks of ice the size of houses that could shift at any moment. At 10 a.m., they reached the GPS coordinates for the Romanian camp. They found nothing. The shelf where Camp 2 had sat was gone, replaced by a 45-degree slope of blue ice and pulverized rock. Lakpa later described the scene. It was like the mountain had been scrubbed with a wire brush. There was no yellow fabric, no gear, no tents, just ice. They used long-range probes, 10-meter carbon fiber poles, to search for the bodies. At every point, the probes hit solid ice before reaching the bottom. The Romanians weren't just buried. They were encased. They were under at least 20 meters of compacted avalanche bread, snow that had been compressed into the density of concrete by the force of the fall. Then, one of the Sherpas spotted a piece of red webbing sticking out of a crevasse 200 meters below the campsite. They descended to it, hoping for a survivor. What they found was a single climbing boot, still laced, with a Romanian-made gaiter attached. There was no foot inside. The force of the slide had been so violent it had stripped the gear from the victims' bodies. Lakpa called off the ground search at 1 p.m. The mountain was warming up again. Rocks were beginning to zip past them like bullets. To stay any longer was to add 4 more names to the death toll. The search for James Whitmore was even more hopeless. Because he was solo, no one knew exactly where he had been when the fracture occurred. Simkata flew the helicopter up to 800 meters, risking a catastrophic engine flame out in the thin air. He scoured the hollow slopes James had described. He saw the fracture line, a jagged, 2-mile-long scar. He saw where the snow had delaminated from the rock, but there was no sign of James. No pack, no headlamp, no neon gear. James had been a ghost in life, and he had become a ghost in death. He had likely been swept into one of the deep, bottomless crevasses at the base of the central pillar. which were now filled with hundreds of tons of fresh debris. At 3:30 p.m., the second disaster occurred. As the rescue helicopter was making a final pass, a secondary hanging glacier at 7,000 meters, weakened by the previous day's collapse, let go. Captain Simcata saw the white cloud erupting above him. He had to perform a hammerhead turn, a violent maneuver that pushed the helicopter to its absolute mechanical limits to dive out of the path of the falling ice. He escaped by less than 50 meters. The downwash from the avalanche nearly sent the helicopter into the face. That was the end. At 4 p.m. on October 4th, the Nepalese authorities officially declared the search over. 5 men were dead. One body was located but unrecoverable due to the danger of the location. 4 bodies were lost forever. The realization at base camp was devastating. In 36 hours, the elite of the climbing world had been erased. The survivors, the kitchen staff, the low-altitude porters, and the few climbers who had turned back had to face the silent tents of the dead. They had to pack up James Whitmore's meticulous gear. They had to find the Romanian team's satellite phone and decide who was going to call Bucharest. They had to look at Antoine Girard's paragliding equipment, still sitting in a crate, waiting for a flight that would never happen. The most painful moment came at 6 p.m., when the sun set behind the south face. The mountain looked beautiful, cold, and indifferent. The clicking radio was silent. The premium weather forecast finally updated, predicting a wager cooling trend for October 5th. It was 24 hours too late. The 5 men weren't coming home. But as the survivors began the long walk back to Lukla, the questions started to surface. This wasn't just an act of God. This was a disaster with fingerprints. Why was Girard at 7,200 meters without acclimatization? Why did the Romanians trust a digital forecast over the smell of the earth? And why did James Whitmore think he could outrun a mountain? When dawn came on October 5th, the mountain was silent. 5 climbers were dead. 5 families were destroyed. And the survivors had to face what they'd done, and what they'd failed to do. The bodies were still on the mountain. But the real battle over blame, truth, and legacy was just beginning. Chapter 7. The official report issued by the Nepal Ministry of Tourism regarding the October 2024 disaster lasted exactly 4 pages. It concluded that the 5 deaths were the result of an unavoidable natural catastrophe caused by an unprecedented geological failure. It was a document designed to protect the industry, not to find the truth. By labeling the event as an act of God, the authorities effectively shielded expedition companies and technology providers from liability. But for the families of the victims and the independent investigators who spent months dissecting the event, the official narrative was a calculated insult. The investigation into the Romanian team's death revealed a disturbing reality about the premium weather services that are now standard in high-altitude climbing. The company providing the data, a European-based firm, had marketed its AI-driven microclimate modeling as the, quote, ultimate safety net. However, forensic analysis of the server logs from October 2nd and 3rd showed that the company's sensors on Annapurna had been transmitting, quote, garbage data for 48 hours prior to the collapse. The extreme heat had caused solar-powered weather stations at 6,000 meters to overheat, leading to a frozen output that repeatedly predicted a cooling trend that didn't exist. The company knew the sensors were malfunctioning, but they never sent a red alert to their subscribers. They didn't want to admit that their multi-million-dollar system could be defeated by a heat wave. Radu, Adrian, and Mihai died, waiting for a, quote, cooling trend that was nothing more than a glitch in an algorithm. Then there was the investigation into Antoine Girard's expedition. It was uncovered that Girard's primary sponsor had a summit-or-nothing clause in his contract for the 2024 season. While Girard was a veteran who valued his life, he was also a man facing the reality of aging in a sport that prizes youth and spectacle. The pressure to deliver the ultimate flight footage was immense. This pressure is what drove the fatal decision to skip his final acclimatization rotation. We now know that the slurred French captured on his GoPro was a direct symptom of high-altitude cerebral edema. Had Girard followed the standard safety protocols, he likely would have recognized the warning signs of the mountain's instability. Instead, he was operating in a cognitive fog, pushed by financial obligations and a desire to cement his legacy. His death wasn't just a climbing accident, it was a byproduct of the professionalization of extreme sports, where the moment is worth more than the man. The case of James Whitmore was the most difficult to investigate because there were no witnesses and no recovery. However, James's mother, Mary, provided investigators with his final journals and his meticulous training logs. They revealed that James had been suffering from a growing sense of disillusionment with the quote-unquote commercial circus of the Himalayas. His decision to climb the Central Pillar, the most dangerous route on the face, wasn't just about speed. It was about escaping the crowds. He felt that the only way to find pure mountaineering was to take risks that others wouldn't. The investigation into James's death highlighted a growing divide in the climbing community. As commercial teams make mountains safer through technology and Sherpa support, independent climbers are pushing themselves into increasingly lethal territory just to find a sense of challenge. James Whitmore died because he was looking for a mountain that no longer exists, a mountain where a man's skill is the only variable. The legacy of the 2024 Annapurna disaster is one of fractured trust. The climbing community is still divided on the ethics of rescue that played out on October 4th. Critics argue that the decision to call off the search for the Romanians was premature, fueled by the cost of helicopter hours rather than the safety of the rescuers. Supporters point to the secondary avalanche that nearly killed Captain Simcata as proof that the mountain was too hot for any human presence. This debate has led to a fundamental shift in how insurance companies view Annapurna. Since 2024, premiums for the South Face have tripled, and many companies now refuse to cover soloists like James Whitmore at all. The Savage Mountain has become an uninsurable mountain. What has changed since those 36 hours of death? In terms of safety protocols, almost nothing. Despite the failure of the AI weather models, climbers still rely on digital forecasts. Despite the risks of thermal inversions, expeditions still push for summit windows in late October. The financial machinery of Himalayan mountaineering is too large and too profitable to be stopped by 5 deaths. The normalization of deviance continues. Each season, the risks are pushed a little further. And each season, the mountain's warnings are treated as manageable variables until they aren't. The families of the victims carry the heaviest burden. In Bucharest, Radu Mate's daughter still has the plastic tiger she gave him for luck. She was told her father is, quote, sleeping in the ice. In Sheffield, Mary Whitmore has turned James's van into a small memorial, a place where other solo climbers come to leave gear and share stories. In Valence, Antoine Girard has become a vocal critic of the sponsorship pressures in extreme sports, fighting to ensure that no other family has to watch their loved one's final moments on a recovered GoPro. The bodies of James Whitmore and the 3 Romanians remain on the South Face, buried under tens of millions of tons of debris. They are now a permanent part of the mountain, their positions marked only by GPS coordinates on a recovery map that will never be used. Antoine Girard's body was never retrieved. The location was deemed too unstable for a long-line recovery. He is still there, entangled in his neon green wing, a silent, colorful marker on a face of white and gray. The final haunting lesson of the 2024 Annapurna disaster is that experience is no longer a shield against a changing world. These 5 men were among the most capable humans on the planet. They had the best gear, the best training, and the most passion. But they were operating with a manual, written for a mountain that no longer exists. The climate had rewritten the rules, and the climbers were still playing the old game. This is the story of 36 hours where the mountain decided it had enough. It is a reminder that in the high-altitude world, the most dangerous thing you can take with you is the belief that you are in control. The mountain doesn't care about your sponsors, your loans, or your dreams. It only cares about gravity and heat. And when those 2 forces align, no amount of experience can save you. What do you think was the real cause? Was it the failure of technology, the pressure of money, or the simple, brutal reality of a warming planet? Leave a comment below with where you are watching from, and the exact time you heard this account. We want to know who is listening to these stories of the high places. If you want to see more deep dive investigations into the disasters that have shaped the history of mountaineering, stories told without distortion and without filler, subscribe to this channel and become a member. Our community is growing, and your support allows us to keep digging for the truth beneath the ice. In our next documentary, we will look at the 2025 K2 bottleneck that claimed 4 lives in a single hour. You won't want to miss it. The dead cannot speak, but the mountain keeps their secrets. And sometimes, The truth is buried so deep that only silence can find it.